Okie dokie. I think, it's just a little bit after the hour, but I want to get started so that we can use up our full time. Welcome to the Medieval Academy of America Graduate Student Committee podcasting workshop. Thank you for taking time to join us today, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. My name is Rita O'Mara, and I am the chair of the GSC this year. Before we get started, I wanted to give a little bit of information on the Graduate Student Committee and the work we do. The GSC is made up of 6 graduate student members from various disciplines who work together to offer a series of services to our global medievalist graduate student community. We have a triennial newsletter that is sent to members of the Medieval Academy, as well as a mentoring program that is linked to three of the major medieval conferences, including Kalamazoo, Leeds, and the MAA annual meeting. If you're interested in signing up for it, I'll share a link soon and you can fill it out at your convenience. The mentoring programs pair graduate students and early career scholars with established faculty or professionals who serve as their mentors throughout the conference and hopefully beyond. And you don't have to be attending the conference in order to sign up for the mentoring program. We also began a podcast series last year called the Multicultural Middle Ages, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about today, and which I welcome you to check out. Our second season is going to be launching this February. Lastly, the GSC is really active on social media, especially on Twitter and Facebook. And from conference panels to webinars like today, the GSC also carries out other initiatives and programs for the graduate community. And many of our previous webinars can be found on the MAA's YouTube page, including soon this one. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and a huge thanks to the Medieval Academy for helping make this event possible, especially Executive Director Lisa Fagan-Davis, Communications and Membership Coordinator Chris Cole, and Medieval Academy President Maureen Miller. Today, we will hear from podcasting experts Logan Quigley, Aylin Malcolm, Sarah Ifft Decker, and Florence H R Scott. Kicking us off today is going to be Logan Quigley. Logan Quigley received his PhD from University of Notre Dame, and his academic research explores our relationships to the spaces around us and the times that precede us. His doctoral research reflected on late medieval pilgrims' innovative ways of representing and manipulating their temporal and spatial experience. And Logan now spends his time thinking about how to help others represent their research, their ideas, and their experiences. He is one of the co-producers of the GSC's Multicultural Middle Ages, and will get us started today. Logan.
Thank you so much, Reed, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's exciting to be here talking in front of you, and I'm really looking forward to representing the Multicultural Middle Ages, which I am one of the series producers of, as well as just to try to call to get more podcasts in the air. I'm a huge podcast fan, so anything I can do to try to increase the number of podcasts out there, I'm really happy about. So. Thanks, Reed. That was a great introduction. I don't need to echo any of it, but I do have my contact information up on the slides that I'm sharing, so you can feel free. Please reach out to me if you have questions or want to get in contact afterwards. Today, I'm going to be focusing in, we're talking about this concept of how to craft an engaging episode when it comes to a podcast. I thought I'd zoom in and think a little bit about audience-specific engagement. That's something I care a lot about as a scholar who works with rhetoric and writing, obviously. And I think it's something that's probably close to home for a lot of us as writers. So let me see. Perfect. Okay, we can move forward here. As I said, the challenge that I want to address here is the challenge of audience engagement. And I thought that the way into this might be to ask a couple of guiding questions. The first is what engages you when you're listening to a podcast? As researchers, as writers, we all know that things that kind of get you excited when you're reading, things that you come across in someone else's writing, how you get the chance to try to implement that in your own writing. And podcasting is very much the same. Being an engaged and interested listener can also help you to be an engaged and interesting writer. I was also, asking this question: what kind of audience do you want to engage? It's important to think critically and to think actively about who is going to be listening to your podcast, who you might want to cater your podcast toward. Now, of course, it's good to reach for a broad audience, but sometimes having a specific kind of audience in mind can just help with the creation and curation process. And then finally, asking this question, are all strategies and techniques that we might appreciate in podcasts going to be equally effective across all different styles of podcasts, all these different approaches? So, I'm going to jump past that one. Basically, just I want to drive home my point. Many of us, if we've been dissertating, if we've written theses before, even long projects, you've probably heard your advisor say, it's hard to write if you're not reading, if you're not taking in research. I very much found that was the case for me while I was dissertating. And I found that with podcasting, it's actually even more true. The more podcasts I'm taking in, the more interested I am in creating podcasts and the more ideas I have about how to kind of engage somebody and create an engaging episode. So I would say, honestly, my first tip is to find podcasts that you really, really like and just be a fan of them. Spend time listening to them. And as you're listening, notice what they're doing and notice how you're engaged and the things that work for you. So in terms of the actual nitty-gritty, I thought that when I started making this presentation, I thought that one of the good ways to go about this might be actually doing a little bit of an informal survey. So even if I ask this question to you right now as you're listening, what engages you when you're listening to a podcast? You might have a couple of things come to mind. And some of the things that I heard from others who I asked, a lot of people mentioned the hook. Whatever it is that comes at the very beginning of the episode is going to make a difference for if you continue listening, if you stay online for it. An intriguing question works well as a hook. Same with a relatable or a dramatic anecdote. But the key with a hook is to withhold some information. You want to, much like writing an introduction, a little differently, but you want to kind of give your audience a sense of where you're going to take them, but you don't want to give them the answers. A lot of the times in papers, we're used to you want to give your thesis and also kind of give the answer to what your argument is going to be in your introduction. You can do that a little bit in a podcast, but by withholding information, you're going to get your reader or your listener rather to keep on with you. A lot of people also mentioned a mixture of voices being important. Now, all of us have listened to podcasts that are monologic before, and all of us have really enjoyed them. They can be done really well. And in fact, with the Multicultural Middle Ages, a lot of the episodes we put out are monologic episodes. So it's not a problem to have a single voice episode, but largely across the board, people tend to be more engaged when there are multiple voices. So whether this is the format of your podcast, you want to approach it from a conversational style, or if you're approaching it from a monologic style, having a friend do some of the reading for you if you have a quote or something, including those in other voices. Hearing somebody else's voice can just break up some of the monotony and refresh the listener's ear. In immersive environmental audio, this is the first one that came to mind for me because I'm a big fan of this. And a couple of the people that I talked to mentioned things like, if you're mentioning research, if you're talking about doing research, the ruffling of pages. If you're talking about a maritime experience, you're writing, it's a historical podcast and it takes place on the sea coast in France or something like that. The sounds of seagulls in the background, or like that dinging noise that we're all familiar with whenever a movie takes place on the ocean. Something like that can really help people feel like they're immersed in whatever the scene is that you're trying to set. And you don't need to go overboard. You don't want it to be just a constant environmental barrage, but whenever there's a key moment that you really want to think like, this is when I want to reground my listener and make sure that they're paying attention, that's a good moment to drop an interesting audio cue. And finally, one takeaway, maybe two. Chances are if you're making a podcast episode, it's going to be somewhere between 20 minutes to 45 minutes. Of course, I'm a huge Las Culturistas fan. They love an hour and a half podcast, and I will listen to it. But for the most part, and especially for educational oriented podcasts, 20 minutes, 25 minutes to 45 minutes is going to be your sweet spot. And for an episode of that length, and in general for audio content, remembering that your listeners are only going to really be able to cling to like one key takeaway or concept, maybe two if they're really well linked and explained, you don't want to overburden them. So thinking strategically about what it is you want them to take away and hanging on to that. So, and finally, I would say relevant connections. This came up over and over again. People just basically kept saying, if I'm listening to a podcast, I want to know how it affects me and the world that I care about. That's, something that we're all used to as scholars, making our research relevant for everybody else, and as podcast writers, as writers yourselves. So that's the stuff to keep in mind. Now, in terms of thinking about an audience that you want to engage, a type of audience, I like to think of this as your avatar. So an avatar would be the perfect audience for your show. This would be someone who you could describe, thinking about who are they. describing their needs or their interests, their obstacles and frustrations. And all of this is key because if you're trying to think of your audience, the reason you want to keep your audience in mind is so that you can cater your episodes to them. And if you have a sense for what their needs are, or for what frustrates them, or for what will get them to turn an episode off, that's really helpful in terms of creating an episode that's going to be engaging. And the best thing is, once you've found your avatar, once you've described to yourself who the kind of person is you like to imagine listening to your podcast, you can go find a person who fits that approach and ask them what they would like to listen to. Chances are you're probably going to have a friend who fits that demographic, because a lot of us make podcasts for us, frankly, and this is something we've all heard as writers. If you're writing, you could be writing for yourself. If you're making a podcast, hopefully it's something you'd want to listen to as well. But finding that avatar and asking them what they're interested in so that you can give them what they want. And what they want tends to be, education or information, but wrapped in a story, made something that they can care about, connections that they can identify with. Relevant cultural connections, like I mentioned, the human details and focus makes a big difference. And finally, actions and takeaways are going to be really key. So again, thinking about only having one actionable takeaway is going to be the most important, especially if it's a small episode. But you can also do, you can fit in more if you feel like you really need to. So thinking about different podcasting styles and approaches, I wanted to just kind of lay out what I think of as the main ways of structuring podcasts. The monologue, which we talked about, that's the most common single human voice one. But the most popular podcasts tend to be ones that have multiple voices going on. So an interview would be you as the host interviewing another guest. So the locus of power is with you. You have your guest, you bring them on and you ask them questions. They may share about 50% of the airtime, but you're the one really guiding the conversation. That's different from a conversational style podcast in which you and a co-host, maybe 2 or 3 co-hosts, but usually it's a pair, sometimes 3, are just having a conversation about a topic, and that's where the power is balanced. And you can let that conversation kind of map itself, even though, of course, you'll probably have some notes to follow. The panel is going to be more people. The way I think of it, it tends to be more like an interview style, where it's one individual guiding the conversation and moving it in an organized manner. But the panel is different from an interview, because in an interview, if you're interviewing one person, it's a lot easier to not step on their toes. If you're working with a panel of 4 different people, you're going to want to think pretty critically about how to make sure that that's not overwhelming to your listener. You can make sure that you can keep all the voices separate and track where everybody needs to be. And then finally, I love a scrapbook or repurposed style podcast. This would be, these styles of podcasts go out and find media that exists in the world, cut it up into small clips, and then repurpose it into podcast episodes for us. Often also, again, with bridged narration to help us understand the connections between those things, but they're largely composed of bits of media that exist in the world. And all of those formats are different because the kinds of techniques you're going to want to use will be a little different. So think about what format you're approaching and what your purpose is, whether it's to educate first and foremost or to entertain first and foremost. But both of those, you're going to want to engage in some form of storytelling, because if you've ever been in a class, all of us have had that experience. You probably know that it's easier to learn when you care about the story and when it's delivered to you in some kind of a narrative format. Now, I want to move forward just before I run out of time to give a little bit of a case study with the Multicultural Middle Ages, which is the podcast that I'm a series producer for, along with Reed. So this is an anthology style podcast. This means that our contributors each contribute a single episode apiece. So every episode is going to be really different. That means that our format is different. Some of our episodes are interview style, some of them are panels. It's all of them. So you can go infer from that. And that means that the style, the approach, and the needs of the audience is going to be a little bit different. But across the board, our overall purpose with this podcast is to educate and to inform. And we do that through an entertaining means. We think a lot about how to keep our audience engaged by entertainment while passing along information about the Middle Ages, the multicultural Middle Ages, and what the Middle Ages were. Features of our avatar, I wanted to suss this out because, like I mentioned, because it's an anthology style podcast, people tend to have different approaches per episode. But across the board, I like to imagine our idealized listener as someone who's curious about our present moment and its roots in our past. Ideally, somebody who's passionate or interested in what I think of as like the modern medieval aesthetic or medievalism. And the reason I think of that as a feature of our listener is because most of our listeners are, we have a lot of academics, but also we have a lot of hobbyists, people who are passionate or interested about the Middle Ages, but don't have a professional connection to it. So that aesthetic is notable, is interesting and important, so that we can make sure we have those connections in there to keep our listeners updated on why we're talking about these things at all and how that matters to them. So I just want to land us here again with these 3 guiding questions that you should keep in mind when you're approaching audience engagement. What is the most engaging to you when you're listening to a podcast? That's your rule of thumb there. That's your North Star. Thinking critically about the kind of audience you want to engage, and probably seeking out somebody who represents that audience and asking them. Again, I want to emphasize, it's great to make a podcast for a broad audience. It's just often easier when you're composing to have someone in mind. And down here across the bottom, again, after thinking about all strategies and techniques, I just have some links. You can listen to our podcast here, and please feel free to reach out. If you'd like to contribute, you can also reach out and let me know that you have something you'd like to say. So I think I'm out of time. I want to stop and pass it along. Thank you all for coming, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of these presentations.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Logan. Thank you. That was great. Next up, we have Aylin Malcolm, who is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Pennsylvania. Their research interests include zoology in medieval England, the history of ecological crisis, and pre-modern gender studies. A former community radio host, Aylin currently co-presents the Codices podcast along with other members of the Digital Medievalist Postgraduate Committee. Aylin, please take it away.
Thank you, Reed, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's really such a pleasure to be in this company. Thanks also, Logan. Those were incredible recommendations, and you should all be checking out the MMA podcast because it's really just so well thought out and well produced. So one of the descriptions that was sent out for this webinar indicated that we were going to discuss the art of drafting and delivering the perfect episode. And I love the enthusiasm of this line, but I have to be honest with you, I can't deliver the perfect episode because the perfect podcast episode doesn't exist. And I mean this in more than the usual sense of perfection being unachievable, because I think the beauty of podcasting is that it's not an art form that aims for perfection at all. It's ad hoc, it's DIY, it doesn't have to be polished to be appealing. And that's why it can be such a wonderful complement to our other scholarly activities, which can be more rigid in format. So today I want to talk about how to make a podcast that's good enough, that's coherently constructive, but also makes the most of the flexibility and informality of this medium. I'm going to focus on long form interviews because that's what I know best, and also because I think podcasting has really revitalized the struggling form of the long form audio interview. And I'm also going to presume that you're one person interviewing one person. I'll be talking about what I consider best practices, but many other formats and opinions are possible, which we can discuss together in the Q&A. So most of the skills required for a great interview are things that we all cultivate during graduate school. As teachers, we know how to ask productive questions, how to respond thoughtfully, how to synthesize material. As researchers, we know how to gain background knowledge, how to seek clarification for challenging ideas, and when to press for more information. And as current or former students, we know that sometimes the best way to respond is simply active listening. Good interviewing involves a constant oscillation among all of these roles. We want to have done our research, we want to be familiar with our interviewee's work, but we also want to be able to inhabit the position of a listener who knows next to nothing about the topic. We want to create the impression of a dialogue, but also allow our guests to do most of the talking. So conventional wisdom holds that the interviewer should only talk about 10% of the time. Finally, we're also capable editors. And even if you've never done sound editing before, many of the basic principles are somewhat transferable from textual editing, which I'll talk about in a bit. So now I want to start with how to prepare questions and set yourself up for a good conversation. Let's say that you've lined up an interview with someone whose work really excites you. So how do you go about preparing for that? First, and most obviously, you're going to want to do some research. Look into their previous work, identify interesting things about their current projects, and maybe take note of some of their accomplishments or accolades, which will help you write the introduction, and I'll talk about that in a moment. During this process, I would actually try to come up with at least 3 categories of question. And by this, I mean that you should not only ask about topics or ideas, but also about process, impact, or lifestyle. So if I were interviewing a manuscript curator, I wouldn't just ask about the last 3 papers they published. I would also want to know about their public outreach work, maybe their digital projects. I might ask about their favorite manuscript for a personal angle or some other question that adds something personal, or I could ask what a day at work looks like. If you are going to talk about one of their publications, it might be helpful to select a quotation and actually read it to them during the interview. This gives you and your listeners context so that you can then ask a follow-up question. Plan to start with something easy. Basically, you want them to feel comfortable as quickly as possible by discussing things that they know well. It's a bit cliched, but interviewers often start by asking how the guest got interested in the topic of the interview and then close with something future-oriented. So if you're talking with a librarian, you might ask about their path toward library studies and then end with the projects that they're planning to do next. You can also ask the interviewee how they would like to start. And I actually sometimes end with curveball questions that come at the topic in a new way, though then you have to be prepared for the interview to maybe run a little long. This is also frequently the way that I end class, so a lot of these things are transferable. Obviously, avoid leading or yes/no questions that don't generate discussion. Apart from your softball opener, it's often a good thing if you have no idea how they're going to answer a question. And if the interview is part of a series, remember the common themes of your podcast. This is usually tied to what you know of your real or ideal audience, which Logan has discussed so beautifully. So with Coding Codices, we often ask about advice for graduate students because we know that this is a pretty big component of our listenership. Once you've got a few questions written, it's good practice to share some samples questions with the interviewee. This does not mean that you have to stick to those ideas or share all of your ideas. 3 to 4 questions is fine. So you've written your questions, you've set up the recording system you're using. And as a side note, if you're using Zoom, make sure that everyone is creating a separate recording of themselves on their own systems in case the connection breaks down. This has saved me multiple times in the past. So during the interview, when you start, I suggest reading a pre-written introduction, and the language here could be very standard across episodes. So you could introduce the podcast with a brief tagline or description, especially if the interview is going to be your whole podcast, your whole episode. Then give your name and then present your interviewee, including some of their accomplishments and whatever else you think is relevant for your listeners to know. This is exactly the same as writing an introduction for a guest speaker, and it has the exact same functions. It lets the audience know what to expect, but even more importantly, it also makes your guests feel welcome and appreciated, which is why I recommend doing the introduction, even if you don't end up using it in the finished episode. And just like when you give a talk, try to write the introduction for your episode or your interview so that it's easy to articulate out loud. So even if there's standard language that you're sharing with other contributors, you want to read it over and sort of take it into yourself and make it your own. My next piece of advice is don't look at your interview questions. This is controversial, I know, but I will read my questions right before the interview, and I'll put them next to me in case my mind goes blank. But I find that conversations actually flow better if I put myself on the spot too. It's daunting, but it's important to remember that you've done the intellectual labor by writing the questions, and you will remember their basic content. Of course, your mileage may vary. If you're doing a very polished episode and you're really good at reading in a way that sounds off the cuff, then don't let me stop you. And also the obvious exception is that if you bring a quotation from their work, you want to be reading that precisely. Otherwise, use your classroom skills, be attentive to your guests' reactions, respond empathetically, be flexible about where the conversation might end up. Podcasting is actually a little more free-flowing than classroom dynamics because there's no set material that you absolutely have to get through. So you can just move on if a topic isn't working. And as a bonus, you don't have to think too much about this, but there are certain ways you can speak that will be easier to edit later on. For instance, you could try to pause when you need to think rather than using filler words or repeating yourself, just to be kind to your editors. Finally, how do you know when to quit? This might depend on your ideal length for the episode. If you want an episode in the 25-minute range, I wouldn't let the interview go much longer than 35 minutes. I have edited 50 minutes down to 25 multiple times, but it can be quite difficult to edit that while preserving the arc of the conversation. This is podcasting, though, not radio, which is, a lot of what I'm saying is informed by radio. So maybe you don't mind how long it is. In which case it's quite simple. Just try to end when your interviewee begins to get tired. And I do mean begins here. So if you have a sense that your or their energy has peaked and is now waning, you might just ask one more synthetic question to wrap up. Often right at the end of a conversation, I'll also ask if there's anything that we neglected to talk about, which they'd like to discuss. This doesn't always go anywhere, but it's a way of checking in and being courteous. And once in a while, you do get some amazing final thoughts. And finally, you may want to do a brief standard concluding statement where you remind your listeners of who you are, what your podcast is, and how they can find out more. So if you have a website or something similar. If you know what the next episode is going to be about, you can state that too. But of course, in anthology podcasts, that can be hard to do. Once you have all of this tape, you can move on to editing, which I'm just going to blaze through. I currently use Logic, which looks like this. I've also used Adobe Audition in the past and Audacity, which is great and free. And you can see this episode has several speaking tracks because it's from a Zoom call where everyone recorded themselves, and then I spliced those things together. Mostly, I focus on arranging things so that there's a rhythm to the conversation and also on maintaining a fairly consistent decibel level. And again, you may already have these skills, even if you've never done audio editing. So on the scale of an entire conversation, audio editing is not unlike editing scholarly writing. It doesn't need to be as laser focused, but it should flow logically, and you can cut things that you find less crucial. On the scale of the sentence, audio editing, podcast editing is highly rhythmic. And here a background in poetry or music can help. And I think as medievalists, we're very used to thinking about poetry as well. So for instance, you could go through and cut every filler word if you wanted, every but you still want the product to reflect the rhythms of a person's speech. I find that sometimes edited interviews sound a little breathless because people trim the gaps a little bit too much, which is a creative choice. But I think generally, if you're doing a podcast, you don't want it to sound breathless like commercial radio. It's sort of a more relaxed medium. So with editing, I try to adhere to a principle that I'm tentatively calling flattering authenticity, which is that the edited podcast should be the best possible version of the interview. It should be true to the guest character while highlighting the most insightful things that they said. And to that end, I always share an edited interview with guests long before it goes public so they can check it. So I mentioned a few kind of core ideas today, one of which is this idea of flattering authenticity. It's also important to resist perfectionism. The best podcast is a done podcast, and the weird stuff is often what makes this medium come alive. And finally, try to reflect on the skills that you already have. You probably already know how to work in this medium, even if you've never done it before. In conclusion, check out my SoundCloud. Coding Codices is a collaboration by members of the Digital Medievalist Postgraduate Committee. We put out new episodes about 6 times a year. The next one will probably feature Dot Porter, interviewed by Caitlin Postal and me. If you are so inclined, I also made a lockdown mini-series about natural resources in Canada called Northern Elements. And generally speaking, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Aylin. That was fantastic. It's really important, I think, for us to remember that perfection is not always the goal and it's not possible. So I appreciate that. Next up, we have Sarah Ifft Decker, who is an assistant professor of history at Rhodes College. Dr. Ifft Decker is the author of Jewish Women in the Medieval World, circa 500 to 1500, a survey and source book which I also personally recommend, and also the author of The Fruit of Her Hands, Jewish and Christian Women's Work in Medieval Catalan Cities. She is also the host of Media-eval, a medieval pop culture podcast, a popular audience podcast that addresses popular perceptions of the Middle Ages in films and other media. And she will also have an episode forthcoming with the Multicultural Middle Ages. All right, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Tareed, for the introduction and invitation, to all my fellow panelists for their insights, and to all of you for attending. So I'm going to talk a little bit about particularly how to go about crafting an engaging episode for an unscripted podcast. And so not only an unscripted podcast, but also one that is a little bit different from what we've talked about so far in a couple of ways. So first of all, this is a podcast that came out of a combination essentially of my love of podcasts and also my passion for complaining about films set in the Middle Ages. And very much, I would say, is in a lot of ways inspired by the podcasts that I mostly was listening to, which weren't per se educational podcasts. They were actually mostly bad movie podcasts. And so, what I do on this podcast, I talk about how people perceive the medieval past through the lens of looking at movies mostly, but also I've looked at TV shows, I've looked at books, I've had an episode on medieval times restaurant. So thinking about essentially kind of what people get right, what people get wrong, and what they tell us about how the medieval past is perceived by people who aren't professional medievalists. So that means also that it has a generally, I would say, kind of popular audience that I tend to anticipate, although I know I have some listeners who are also medievalists, I tend to assume that most of my listeners aren't necessarily medievalists and aren't necessarily historians or academics, and that they're just people who, like pop culture and think that this is an interesting angle. And is then, I would say, in style, tends to be inspired more by pop culture podcasts. Because of that, I also will note that I tend to have longer episodes, so that I have some, I would say most of my episodes kind of come in around 2 hours. Although I have some that are 3, which I usually try to avoid, but it has happened in the past with things that, me and a guest are both really, really excited about. Like I think the Game of Thrones one that I did with my mom actually went like very long. I think it was actually 4 hours and I edited down to 3. So that also, I would say kind of depends on your audience, mileages vary, but especially for pop culture podcasts, that's the kind of model that I'm basing it on, or podcasts that often are in the kind of 1.5 to 3 hour range. So how do you craft an engaging episode without actually scripting one? So I wanted to talk about a couple of strategies that I use to do that. So first of all, start off by making your guests feel comfortable. So we, I think Logan mentioned the kind of different styles, right, of podcasting. This is very much a conversational style. The vast majority of my episodes are me and a guest co-host. I used to have a consistent co-host who is unfortunately no longer able to do the podcast regularly. And so now I just bring somebody on. Sometimes those are people who are also medievalists. Sometimes they're just people who love a particular piece of media and are excited to get to talk about it. So with that, starting off, as I said, by making guests feel comfortable, which is, I would say, also important in that, I've had a range of guests in terms of their, experience and expertise in terms of podcasting. Some of them are people who, have their own podcasts. Some of them are people who are doing this for the very first time. And also some of them are people that I know really, really well. I've had some very close friends on. As I said, I've had both my parents on, and some of them are people that I'm actually basically having a conversation with for the first time. So in terms of making guests feel comfortable, I really recommend, first of all, providing some information and some notes in advance, making sure that they have a sense of what the format's going to look like, what's going to be expected of them, and also giving them time to ask any questions that they have, both before, anything is kind of get started in terms of, recording or talking, via messaging or email or whatever, but also giving time once you actually get started to have the guests, ask any last minute questions that come up. And also, I actually definitely recommend chatting a little bit before actually beginning the, proper part of the episode. That can even be while you're already recording, and then it's just easy that, you cut that out as, right away once you're editing, which I'll talk about more in a moment. The flow of the conversation hopefully then does some of the work for you in terms of this being engaging, that if you have, somebody that, you're comfortable, you have a good rapport, you're both excited about the subject and engaged, that I think that really helps with, in turn, having a conversation that's going to engage an audience as well. But I also find that even if you're doing an unscripted podcast, that having segments are really helpful to offer some structure without scripting. So typically I start with an introduction, which actually is scripted as a just kind of very brief, this is my intro. Spend some time identifying media and talking about the cast, and in the case of, film and television, discussing the actual film. And then I kind of do that and then separate out sections where I talk about some, big, things they did well or things that they did really, really not well, which there are often more of. And then kind of go in depth on a real person or event. And also I have a little kind of fun things. I have people pitch a film that would be inspired by this one, and also have people rate this piece of media based on their personal criteria, which sometimes is somebody who loves a piece of media saying this is 5 stars, and me saying this is this made me angry in these 6 ways. And so I'm giving it like 1. I also find that having notes is really helpful, that I would say I very rarely script any kind of details, with the exception of, I think as Aylin was mentioning, right, if you're going to quote something directly, which I sometimes will in particular quote from primary texts, that if you're going to quote something directly, obviously have that written out and read, but that I like just having kind of like an outline and notes, just in terms of reminding me what are the kind of big points that I want to make, but not necessarily having a script. And that's something that I always share with my guest co-hosts as well, so that they have that in front of them and can also get a sense of what this is going to look like. But that, as I said, neither of us is just reading it from a written script per se. And I also think it's useful to think about, and this is something that Aylin touched on as well, how to utilize skills that we already have in different ways. So in particular, thinking about how, if you're already skilled at giving perhaps an engaging, non-scripted lecture, that this is really potentially the same kind of skill that can be brought to bear if you're also hoping to give an engaging, non-scripted podcast. And that's, for me, something that then comes up in terms of the kind of transition from, the just kind of talking through the film, which is, more casual, and which is something where, my often non-medievalist guests are also fully engaged. But then sometimes I move into the part where I talk about, what the film does well or not, and kind of talk about, all right, here's some kind of real context about something related to the film. That often ends up being at the end kind of a bit more of me talking, as I said, at least when I have people who aren't also academics and experts in the field. And for that, kind of thinking about, okay, how am I then kind of bringing in these skills that I use in the classroom in terms of kind of making this material engaging, and kind of providing then sometimes a space for my guests to kind of like bring in kind of questions potentially that they have as well. So and that's then, of course, where it kind of goes back also to making sure that if you have guests, that your guests feel comfortable and feel like they're able to be part of that conversation. I want to talk a little bit also briefly about audio editing, and in particular to note that when you have a non-scripted conversational podcast, that means that you get a number of things that you're not necessarily going to get when you have a, more scripted podcast. One of the big things are tangents that can be, wildly disconnected from anything that you are actually talking about. So those are often things that get cut out. It also depends for me on how long the episode is. If the episode comes in relatively short, I might keep the bit where we talk about, how this actor performed in a different film for 10 minutes. I might cut it down from 10 minutes, but, I might keep that in. If the episode came in at 90 minutes, I'm probably going to cut that out if the episode came in at over 2 hours. So essentially kind of thinking about what your ideal episode length is, and that you can essentially be a sort of more aggressive audio editor or a less aggressive audio editor, depending on how close that episode comes to its ideal length. So that's, I would say, a kind of big part is, thinking about basically also just kind of listening through it yourself and figuring out how you can go about basically making sure that you're maintaining the flow of the conversation, but also getting rid of those things that, nobody actually needs to listen to. And that is really kind of like apart from perhaps the main goal of what you're talking about in this podcast, or that's repetitive actually is something that also often certainly happens when you're doing a more conversational podcast. And I know I certainly repeat myself and I'm like, oh, I said this, I made this point 20 minutes ago and I don't need to make it again here. So then finally, the last thing that I kind of wanted to conclude on in terms of things to keep in mind for crafting an engaging episode is how important it is to let your own enthusiasm come through. That the most engaging episodes are always going to be ones where it's really clear that the people who are doing the talking are also engaged, are also really excited. And that can be, could be pieces of media that, you love. It could be pieces of media that you passionately hate. It could be ones that you ultimately are like weirdly indifferent about. But I've done all three of them. But that, having a kind of engagement and investment in and excitement about the conversation and about at least some aspect of the material is, I think, always going to make for an episode that is ultimately more engaging. So thank you all so much. And I will turn it back over to our last panelist then.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think really like excited people excite people. And I think that definitely comes through in your podcast. Last, but certainly not least, we have Florence H R Scott, who is a writer and a medieval historian. Alongside studying for a PhD on early medieval queenship and coronations at the University of Leeds, they write and produce the popular Substack newsletter and podcast, Ælfgif-who, which provides biographies of women who lived in England in the early medieval period to an audience of over 26,000 subscribers. Florence, please take it away.
Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks to everybody else who came as well. I'm going to preface this by saying I do have a bit of a chest infection, so if you do listen to my podcast and you're thinking that's not your voice, that's why. So I'll try and get through this without kind of coughing too much. So if you'd allow me to begin with a bit of a self-indulgent story about how my Substack newsletter and podcast Ælfgif-who came about. So at the beginning of the third year of my PhD, which, as you just heard, it takes a pretty specialist angle on liturgical documents surrounding early medieval queenship and coronations, I experienced a bout of unexpected chronic illness, and that left me basically housebound, mostly bedbound, unable to put any thoughts into a straight line at all, and obviously I had to take some time off the thesis. So when I returned to my academic work after some slight health improvements, we were now slap bang in the middle of a pandemic. And not to be dramatic, but my entire philosophy on academic work had changed in that period. I think there's something about kind of constant existential threat that is weirdly clarifying. So I was simply no longer content to pour my now extremely limited energy into my work to only have two already very expert people read it. My thinking now is basically that if everything I spend my time doing is now a negotiation with my own health, that my research needs to feel more worthwhile than it was. So, and also I think 15 months of being kind of housebound and then locked down in a pandemic kind of left me feeling desperate for community. So I was ready to reach out. So from the beginning of Ælfgif-who, basically the entire point was accessibility in every sense of that word. So it emerged out of a health crisis, both a personal health crisis and also a global health crisis. So disability access was very acutely in my mind when I started it. But it also emerged from the desire to make the information that I was able to gather about history as a historian through my own privilege of having had, an academic education, and perhaps even more importantly, having institutional access to academic publications, that most people would not even know where to begin looking for this information, right? So these aspirations probably sound quite lofty. At the time, they really weren't. I started my newsletter and podcast about medieval women in the period and area that I work on, so England in the early medieval period. The biographies are free to access and they will remain free, though I do provide some paywalled content just to kind of pay the bills, but they're set at the lowest price possible. So I'm really thinking about accessibility with that. My aim at the beginning was to make it to 100 subscribers. So that's not 100 people from my academic field. I think there's probably not even 100 people in my academic field, but that's specifically 100 people who otherwise wouldn't have known anything about early medieval women if they hadn't, heard my podcast. So I set that goal 2 years ago when I started the publication. And today my subscriber list now stands at precisely 29,191 people. So I'm not just telling you that because I'm bragging, although I am very, very proud of those numbers. But I basically believe that the popularity of Ælfgif-who is directly due to setting accessibility as my main goal from day one. And so I guess accessibility is pretty much what I want to focus on today. So Ælfgif-who, which is the name of the podcast, is a pun on the fact that basically in the 11th century, just about every single English woman was called Ælfgif-who. They had no imagination whatsoever. Every woman was called this. I remember when I was doing my undergraduate degree, feeling distinctly like I just never wanted to ever research this period ever again, because all of the Old English names, the Ælfgif-whos, the Ælfwins, the Æthelstans, Æthelreds, etc., were very confusing, and I didn't know what was going on. And I suppose when I started the newsletter, I was trying to tap into that feeling of coming to a period of history afresh, confused and scared. So when I created the name, that's what I was kind of channeling, and I also think it was a pretty good pun. So once I had my concept, which was basically short biographies of women who lived in England in this period, or groups of women as well, I had to choose a platform. So from the off, I was pretty set on using Substack, specifically because this platform gave you the ability to write a post and then attach a podcast to that post. So I really wanted every installment of the newsletter to have a text and an audio component, which were as identical as possible, so that each one would be equally accessible to people with visual impairments, people who are hard of hearing, people who experience like auditory processing issues. I basically just spent months lying in a dark room, struggling to look at anything for a very long period due to fatigue. So having the combination of text and audio was really important to me. And that means that my podcast episodes, for the most part, are scripted, which means they're not off the cuff, relaxed or free flowing, which is a compromise. Obviously, I think that both approaches definitely have their good points and their bad points. But I think that the compromise was kind of worth it for what I wanted to achieve specifically with what I was doing. I think that considering who your audience is, which we've touched on already, is probably the most important factor in crafting a good podcast episode. I wanted to aim my podcast at intelligent, curious adults who are interested in history, but who probably have little to no academic history training, and who might not know anything about the period in question. So luckily, I do know a lot of people who kind of fit that demographic. And so I often write with a particular person in mind, like a friend or a family member. What I was very careful not to do is to fall into a trap of talking down to my audience. Never ever assume that your audience is unintelligent just because they don't have the same knowledge as you. I have turned off many a history documentary in the past because I felt the presenter was almost trying to trick me into finding history interesting by contriving to make it kind of cool or relatable. I think my philosophy is that anyone I have to persuade that learning about history or women in history is interesting, they have not signed up to my publication in the first place. They are not there, they are not my audience. So I think that you can assume that your audience has a certain degree of enthusiasm built in already, I think. But at the same time, I think you need to be constantly aware of what knowledge base your audience might have. I ask myself when writing every single sentence, and I'm not exaggerating here, will my audience have the knowledge to understand this? If I talk about, for example, hagiography as a genre, so this is, a form of literature about the lives of saints, do I have to define that term? Can I use another term that's less specialist, less off-putting? Can I assume my audience know who Charlemagne is, for example? What about Alfred the Great? If I quote a primary source from the period, will I need to find a modern translation? If I do find a translation, is it from maybe the late Victorian period and too archaic? So can I provide a better one, etc., etc., etc. I do this with every sentence that I write, and these are questions that I'm constantly asking as I prepare my script. I think of my audience kind of imagining that subscriber who I feel kind of represents my audience, try to tap into, I guess, what I knew when I approached the topic for the first time, or even just imagining that I am approaching somebody else's specialism and what I would know about that, and then trying to kind of create the equivalent. I think that the best advice I've pretty much ever come across, and I can't remember exactly who said it, so I do apologize. It was probably a tweet actually, but is never to write with a bad faith reader in mind. So you always need to write for your most enthusiastic, most interested subscriber who loves what you do. The absolute minute you start writing for this reader in your head who's going to tear apart everything you say, or God forbid you're writing for the most respected expert in your field who might be looking to kind of disagree with you or catch you out, you're not going to produce good writing. You're not going to produce a good podcast. You will absolutely tie yourself in knots, hedging every sentence and including far too much reasoning and information with everything. And let's be honest, that's what academic writing is for. That's not what the podcast is for. I think by all means, cite scholars whose work you use, provide reading suggestions if you want, quote other authorities, give credit where credit is due, definitely. But if you're speaking or writing for a public audience, you have to trust yourself that the way you've processed the information is reasoned and valid and is coming from a knowledgeable, sensible perspective. I think if you don't trust your own expertise, then how can you expect your readers to trust your expertise? And I think that once you've produced something that your audience is capable of understanding, then, they know why you've said what you've said, you've provided your reasoning, you've argued it out, they trust your judgment. It's kind of in their hands. You can't make someone fall in love with your obscure specialism. You can only kind of hand people the ingredients to understand your obscure specialism. And I think if you can do this, I guarantee that some people will fall in love with it, and you'll end up with a community of kind of dozens, hundreds, in my case, even thousands of people who all are enthusiastic about what you're enthusiastic about, but they have to be able to access it in the first place, is what I will say. So sorry, that wasn't too specific. That was more of a kind of philosophical treatise on public history, but yeah, that's what I have to say. Thanks.
No, that was perfect. And thank you for sharing your personal story. Your approach and ethos definitely comes through in your podcast. So it's great to hear about the background for it. So thank you to everyone for sharing these presentations. I think it has definitely demystified a lot of, what goes into a podcast episode and how people can start, creating their own or approaching this topic going forward. We do have ample time for questions. If anyone in our audience would like to post a question, you can put it in the Q&A function and I'll be monitoring that. If anyone of our speakers has a response to something someone else said, I encourage you to bring it up now, or I can pitch a question. I wrote down like 50 questions.
I have a question or a response. It's a question, I think, and it's both for Aylin and for Sarah. I'm preparing for an interview. I'm getting ready to interview someone for an episode, and I'm really curious. Both of you talked a little bit about working with people, and I wondered, in your experiences, how you go about dealing with interviewing someone you know well, and how I guess the place I'm coming from is thinking, when you're interviewing someone you don't know well, you are in the same position as your listeners where, you're getting to know them. And so it's probably easier to ask the same kinds of questions that your listener knows. Whereas I would imagine working with a family member or a really close friend, there's probably a lot that doesn't need to be said between you two that you have to remember to say verbally for your listeners. I guess, is that the case? And what are your experiences negotiating the differences between someone you do know well versus someone you're just meeting?
So I'm happy to go first, since I know I talked about, having family members on. So first of all, that I do always, and I, tell people in advance that I'm like, you're going to have to kind of introduce yourself. And that includes that, like, we might, say something about what a relationship is to one another. And that, that is going to be something, right, that I'm going to kind of bring in and have us kind of talk overtly about. I would say part of it is also that that's part of the work, I think, of, you as the host, is being mindful of that, and of when something then gets brought up, filling in that context, right? That the person who, especially if it's somebody who doesn't podcast regularly, is thinking more about, okay, here's a conversation that we're having, as opposed to here's a conversation we're having that, hundreds of people are going to listen to. Then that's your job as host to be then say, okay, you mentioned this backstory that is necessary, right, for the fact that you brought up this. So that's definitely, I think, part of the work to keep in mind. And it goes back and forth, right? I think it brings a kind of nice level of comfort if you have that pre-existing relationship, but also means that you have to maybe kind of think through more what kinds of things you might have to explain that don't occur to your guest.
Yeah, I think that's all really true and great. And I think definitely being able to inhabit the position of an audience member, Florence talked about this extensively, so I'll just sort of echo that, thinking about what you know that they might not know, and sort of asking during the interview for people to clarify things, remembering always that you can edit that later. So if somebody brings up a point that maybe you were talking about the day before yesterday, and prefaces it by saying, well, it's like we were talking about, you can sort of ask them to state what it was that you were talking about. I think also not assuming that you know everything about your interviewee or your companion is really helpful. Sometimes you get people who say very different things on microphones than they would otherwise. I remember once in the radio studio, I interviewed this is kind of getting off, but there was this scream metal frontman who came in, and on microphone, he was very timid, despite getting up on stage and sort of yelling out all the time. And finally, maybe consider asking another person to join in the interview as a co-interviewer. I find that has been really fun and helpful in the past.
Awesome. Thank you both for kicking us off with that question. Or thank you, Logan, for starting us off with that question for both of your answers. We do actually have some questions coming in, which is exciting. So we have a first question, which is, how do you approach inviting experts onto podcasts and handling rejection if it doesn't work out? I don't know who wants to take a crack at this one first.
I suppose I can just jump in because I asked you both to answer a question, so I might as well do a little bit of the answering. I can't necessarily speak directly. I don't have a ton of experience reaching out to people who I think of as like people who I was really intimidated to, but we, with the Multicultural Middle Ages, a lot of our episodes, we do like to solicit contributions from people who we're really excited to hear from. And it is true that sometimes people are not able, people are very busy, so a lot of the time it's timing. If so many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the experience of handling rejection or handling the experience of having a bad course review or having, student feedback come in and be a little negative. And that experience is honestly relatively similar, I think, to the experience of, reaching out and being shot down by somebody who doesn't necessarily want to speak to you on the podcast, which is really, number one, just trying to remember that above all, it's not personal. People are very busy. People have a lot of anxieties also about being representing themselves in a medium that is going to last forever, right? So it's going to be recorded, and not everybody wants to do that. So I think the most important thing is to remember that it's not personal, and really, they probably were actually flattered to be invited. They just didn't want to put themselves out there. And if it is personal, and if they come back and they really come back swinging, you can write them off as somebody who maybe was in a bad place that day or just not having a good day. So you don't need to take that seriously. But I think the same advice that I always I take for myself and I always give people with course evals is also talk to someone who you know really well. And if the email comes in and you're too afraid to read it, have a friend open it up for you and tell you how it is. Or if the email comes in and you read it and you're feeling down about how, having that rejection, talk to another person and just talk it through with them, and they'll help you ground yourself in remembering that you're doing a great job with your podcast. There are so many good experts out there. So if somebody isn't available to you, that just is an opportunity to rethink the episode and to take it in another direction that's going to be just as exciting, even if it's maybe not with that individual.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that and say that, no matter how difficult that rejection is going to be, and sometimes it can feel very personal if somebody doesn't want to talk to you for whatever reason, it's absolutely worth the risk to ask experts to be on your podcast. just the chance to get to speak to somebody who has a lot of experience and a lot of expertise and tap into that. And also, you know, if somebody has a big profile, accessing their audience as well, so that you can cross audiences with someone else. It's absolutely worth the risk to ask, even if it does feel kind of bad if they do say no. You can always, you know, as Logan just said, just ask somebody else and keep asking until somebody wants to be on your podcast, and it's absolutely fine. And no one will know who isn't on your podcast. Your audience will only know who is on your podcast as well. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you both. I think those are really good answers. And I think something that we've come across with the multicultural Middle Ages is also just being like, we will handle all of the difficult audio or, you know, editing stuff. And I think that can also help put potential contributors at ease, which does lead us into another question we have from an anonymous attendee asking, could you suggest a website where one can learn the building blocks and the how-to of creating a podcast? Same question regarding audio editing.
I just dropped, just to jump in here, I answered, there is a website that I had found really useful when I started learning. It's podcastingresourcesguide.com. And it's just it's an amalgamation of a bunch of different resources. You can kind of click through and see a lot of different ideas. But I also, you know, we have, I know the MAA put together, or the GSC put together last year, a document with like links to resources that we had suggested in the last year's webinar. So suggestions for software to use if you're trying to do, you know, if you're capturing audio remotely and you're both in two separate locations, and you know, recommendations on editing software and things to use. Do we still have access to that document? I wonder if that would be an option.
Yeah, I will look into it.
I think I might have it too, so I'll also look in the background and try to find that.
I'll add as well, if anyone would like to, if anyone is in particular interested in audio editing using Audacity, which is a free software, and I would say, you know, relatively intuitive, but, you know, not 100%. I a while ago for a workshop came up with a kind of guide to Audacity and, you know, for audio editing, and would be happy to share that with anybody who reaches out and is interested.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I did just say, I found that document. I'll drop the link in chat really quick to the GSC's specific links document.
Okay, perfect. It looks like we have another question coming in. I take the opportunity that there are so many medieval/media/film experts here. How accurate should a feature film be, for example, seeking as many viewers as possible with historical facts in mind? Is a medieval film with halfway correct facts and many viewers still better than from a historian's point of view than a medieval film with very correct content and only a handful of viewers?
So I'll take that. I have somewhat mixed feelings. On the one hand, I think that to some extent, you know, these things that really get a lot of people excited, I have a lot of positive things to say about, at least in the sense that, you know, they get people interested, and sometimes they get people, you know, reaching out and learning more. I know somebody who, you know, not a little beyond medieval, but the person who is my guest talking about the TV show Reign about Mary, Queen of Scots, which historically is a disaster, you know, that is a person who, you know, is not a professional historian, who then like learned a ton about Mary, Queen of Scots because she watched this show. And, you know, I think that anything that, you know, gets that interest going, there's a lot of positive things to be said about that. On the other hand, there are also, I would say, things that annoy me more than others. On the one hand, there are definitely things that I get kind of like grumpy. I'm like, this is such a small thing, you could have just gotten right. But there are also things that really, I would say, kind of bother me because I think they're sort of insidious and damaging. That, you know, it really bothers me, for example, that it's very rare that films set in the Middle Ages will have female characters that are anything except they're either modern feminists plopped into the, you know, 13th century, or they're just like absolute doormats. And the idea that some semi-authentic medieval woman could have agency is kind of all but unheard of. And I think there, and also like the ways in which it's just like, yes, everything was a nightmare for women all the time in ways that obviously it isn't now. And that they kind of make things worse in the Middle Ages. And I think that's very much designed to basically say essentially, well, women now, you have it better. You should probably kind of shut up about it. So there are things like that that I think really bother me in terms of kind of very common inaccuracies that I would really like actually to see more films that don't do that sort of thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think it's a good point. So we don't have any other questions in the Q&A, but one I wanted to ask just for potentially anyone in the audience who is just now beginning to start their journey into creating a podcast is, how do you build consistency in your podcast, either across episodes and seasons, and really begin to develop a brand, I suppose?
I suppose I'll jump in here. It's a little, so the Multicultural Middle Ages, like we mentioned, it's an anthology style podcast. So every episode is pitched by and written by, recorded by, and essentially produced by a completely different person. Our goal with the Multicultural Middle Ages and with starting it was to allow, researchers, graduate students especially, but really also anybody who's researching the Middle Ages and wants to make an episode about how their research engages with its multiculturalism and with the Middle Ages as, the plurality that they were. So we kind of went in with that perspective, and that means that we want to give a lot of ownership and agency to the creators. So there's not a lot of internal consistency from episode to episode. So a couple of the things that we try to do with each creator, we work with them to try to make sure that, all the episodes at least adhere to the general kind of like thematic principles of our podcast. So we do try to make sure they all fall under the same kinds of like overall questions and interests that we have going. But also for us, it's been a lot about the tags at the beginning and the end. Having theme music, having a little bit of a verbal tag at the end that reminds listeners like where to subscribe or what this podcast that they just listened to was. So it's a lot of those the apparatus that also feels very official. And once you get that down and you put it together, suddenly you're like, wow, oh my gosh, I actually have a podcast. Before I just had audio, and now it's a full-on episode. So I feel like zhuzhing up the professionalism of it can help a lot with that.
This is just a small point, but it can be really helpful to have a few episodes prepared before you start posting them, especially for your first season. I think we prepared something like 4 episodes as a buffer, which helps you adjust to the rhythms of releasing an episode every couple of weeks, say.
Yeah, I think I would just say as well that one factor that I don't think we've really discussed much is the kind of marketing angle of having to do podcasts, is that you can make a really great podcast, but unless you know how to market it, or you have somebody there who knows how to market it, no one's going to hear how great it is. And I think that is maybe an underestimated thing about doing a podcast, is that it's not just about the audio editing and the getting great speakers and everything. It's that you have to kind of know a little bit about maybe social media marketing, digital marketing, things like that. And it is absolutely invaluable to just learn a little bit about that when you start, if that is something that you're going to have to do. I did a free digital marketing qualification with Google when I started, and I found that to be absolutely invaluable for growing an audience. If you don't have an audience inbuilt, which a lot of people just don't have when they're first starting out, that can be a really good thing. Thinking about branding and things like that can really make it seem that professional and consistent.
I would also say really helpful to kind of think about basically how you're understanding and developing your own voice, that especially in cases of podcasts where, you might be the consistency, right? That it might be that it's you and some guest or guest co-host every episode, that thinking about essentially how do you envision this podcast? How do you want to guide this? How do you want to kind of have confidence in your own voice and how that sets the tone of the podcast? That's absolutely going to be a kind of big part of it in terms of that kind of sense of there being some consistency, even if, of course, the episodes have differences from one another.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for answering our questions and also for your presentations today. I'm huge fans of all of your podcasts. And so it's really great to see all the work that goes into it and how it has created these podcasts that are really enjoyable to listen to and teach us a lot about the Middle Ages. We are coming up on the end time for our webinar. So I just want to say that if you have feedback on this event, I'm posting the feedback form in the chat. And also this will be posted on the MAA's YouTube channel soon. And there you can also find 2 of our previous webinars on podcasting that more explicitly deal with audio editing. Thank you again so much to all of our panelists. I'll applaud and assume that our attendees are as well. Thank you all so much. We hope to see you next time.